on the farm of tomorrow in the UK. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ted Christie Miller. I run the Net Zero work here at Onward. Onward, for those of you who don't know, Onward is a think tank with the mission to renew the centre right for the next generation. And today we're gathered to answer a sort of burning question of our time. So how do we bring down emissions in the agricultural sector and make the way that we consume greener and cleaner? So the sector is currently responsible for roughly a tenth of the UK emissions, and it's decreased by just 13% since 1990. According to the Climate Change Committee's sixth carbon budget, we need to decrease that by 23% from 2020 levels to by 2030, just to get us on track for the net zero mission. And so we're gathered here today really to discuss how the sector can innovate towards that decarbonisation goal. And as we've discussed in our research in the past, there are a number of different options of how we can do this. We've discussed potentially agriculture, the ETS, for example. We also looked at how the government can support innovative farming practices like cultivated meat, that we're going to be talking a bit about today, or vertical farming. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the panel's ideas about new and exciting ways we can innovate the sector. So to discuss these issues and much more, I'm delighted to bring together such an experienced group of people and a number of brilliant speakers together for this panel. So our first speaker today is Victoria Prentice MP, Minister of State in the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Before entering politics for 17 years, Victoria was a lawyer for the Treasury Solicitors Department and headed up the government's Justice and Security team. Our second speaker is Tom Bradshaw, Vice President of the National Farmers Union. Tom is a farmer in North Essex and has represented the NFU from local branch chairman through to chair of the National Commonwealth Crops Board. Our third speaker is Anthony Brown MP, esteemed member of the Onward Advisory Board and Member of Parliament for South Cambridgeshire. Anthony is also the chair of the APPG on the environment and a member of the Treasury Select Committee. Before becoming an MP, Anthony was a leading national journalist working for BBC, The Observer and The Times. And then our final speaker today is Dr. Russ Tucker. Russ is the co-founder and CTO of Ivy Farm Technologies, our sponsor today. So before forming Ivy Farm, Russ worked as a management consultant at BCG, and Russ actually comes from a family of butchers, which I'm sure he'll go on to talk about later, but became involved in cultivated meat after joining forces with Oxford University, where he completed a doctorate in 2014. So that's a quick intro into the lineup we've got today, which is a really fantastic group, and I'm really looking forward to their remarks in just a moment. Finally, I'd just like to thank Ivy Farm for partnering with us on this event and making it all possible. And just some housekeeping for the event. We will hear from each speaker for about 5 minutes, and after that we'll have a question and answer session. So without further ado, I'd just like to turn to Victoria for her opening remarks.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much for hosting this. I think this is a conversation worth having. I'm not quite sure where we're going with it, so I'll just do a fairly broad intro, but happy to take this conversation in any direction. It's interesting that you you introduced me as a lawyer, which of course I am, and I think regulation is really what I want to talk about at 9 o'clock in the morning. But that may not be a universal trait. The other half of me is a farmer, and like many farmers, I have farmed part-time all my life, and it wasn't really till I got to London, where I'd always been for work as a lawyer, that I realised when I arrived in Parliament that the farming part of me needed to very much join in this conversation in Parliament as well. I think as we become a society that gets further from the soil, if you like, it's important that those of us that do farm and produce the food that we all enjoy several times a day, we hope, do dig into this conversation and not let it get too far from its farming roots. So regulation obviously matters to me, but I think it does matter to farmers, and I think it is important that as we leave the Common Agricultural Policy and we start to work up our future farming schemes that we've talked about in many other events at this conference, so I probably won't wax lyrical about them this morning unless people want to. I think it is important that we make sure that we have the regulatory framework that suits us. I've never forgotten that my first meeting with the regulation team in DEFRA about 20 months ago now, when they said, oh, it's really important that we have a regulation which tells you exactly what calves' drinking water should be like. And I thought, well, hang on, I've kept calves almost all my life. I'm a lawyer who's quite into this stuff. I had no idea there was a regulation about calves drinking water. And I think that takes us back to the very point of regulation, which is that there's little use in it if nobody who's supposed to be abiding by it is aware of what the regulation is, let alone being tested or checked for whether or not they are sticking to it. So I'm very, very happy if the group wants to talk about regulation and where we're going with that. I think there will be a process of simplification of regulation. This is not easy. Well, what we did as we left the EU was import wholesale, and we're now checking through that regulation to see what's needed and what suits us in this country, at the same time, as you know, as doing some really exciting things in future farming and moving towards a world where farmers are producing public goods for public money and a very different way of looking at supporting farmers, which is exciting. So I think in the alternative protein sphere, which I suspect we're also talking about this morning, it's important to remember that we're at an exciting time for food generally. We had the food strategy the set out by Henry Dimbleby in July. Lots of ideas in that. It was an independent report, that's not government policy. The government has said it will respond probably early next year, in about 6 months from the strategy. We're working on it hard at the moment. And alternative protein is obviously one of the topics that was raised by Henry. We're looking at really 4 different types of alternative proteins to meat and dairy, though I'm personally very keen on both meat and dairy, and was delighted to eat a bit of cheese on my way in, which I probably shouldn't have done, but there we are. It's still very early in the morning, but a long day ahead of us. So the ones which I know we will be promoting, and I don't think this is much of a spoiler for the government white paper, without hesitation, are looking to increase the amount of pulses and beans and protein-rich legumes which we grow. I am sure that in our response to Henry's paper that we will want to set out a positive vision of food. I'm very keen that people should eat healthily, but also that they should enjoy what they eat, and it should be delicious and something to celebrate. And I think the way to do that in our white paper is to talk positively about food and the way it's produced, and promote things rather than say, well, you know, I'd rather say you should be eating more of this, and that might lead to you eating less of something else. But actually, I am sure without hesitation we will be promoting pulses, for example, which are a great alternative protein. On the other forms of alternative protein, so broadly microbial fermented proteins such as corn, or interesting things happening in the seaweed space at the moment, you know, they're newer. I have concerns about ultra processing. I'm somebody who likes to know exactly where my meat, dairy and alternative protein comes from. I like to know traceability, and we are also working on labelling, so we can talk about that if we want to. So I think microbial fermented, that's always my wariness about that sector, but definitely interesting, definitely worth looking at, particularly the algae and seaweed space, which I'm personally very interested in. Then we've got the lab-grown cultivated meat, which I'm sure Russ will tell us more about. Also, you know, happy to look, interesting, but quite a long way off, I think, at the moment in this country, and of course not permitted by regulation at the moment. And then we have insects, which we shouldn't forget. Again, not something we've traditionally eaten much of in this country, but also worth looking at because they do definitely have potential for use in feeds, for example. So lots to talk about.
No, thank you, Victoria. I'm really interested. I was particularly interested in your sort of focus on regulation there, but also I'd be interested to hear later on just a bit about how we can help propel innovation in all of these different sectors. But yeah, just moving on now to
Thank you very much and good morning everybody. What's the vision for how we as UK farmers are going to produce the food of the future? We need to be the best in the world. That has to be our overarching ambition, and whatever policy we derive for the future needs to lead us to being the best in class. We need to have the lowest environmental footprint, we need to have the lowest biodiversity impact, we need to produce the most sustainable food. And that, for me, it's not about lab-grown protein, it's not about rewilding, it's about how do we feed the population of England sustainably, how do we build our export base for the products that we genuinely are best in class, and actually which products don't we produce here, because we can't be world leading. And that, to me, is how we move this discussion forward. What is more sustainable than converting sunlight into protein? I'd say nothing is more sustainable than converting sunlight into protein. 70% of the UK will grow nothing other than grass. And if we don't utilise that free energy source, which is sunlight, and turn it into protein which we can eat, then actually we're massively wasting that resource. I think for me, it's still very questionable whether trees will definitely store more carbon than a well-managed grassland. And we need the science, we need the evidence to put forward the discussions about how we're going to change land use for the future. You know, we're very open to having these conversations about land use change, but it needs to be science and evidence-based when we're making these decisions about how we change things for the future. Because if we do decide to rewild parts of England, we're not rewilding it for 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. It's gone. We won't be producing food on that land in the way we have been over the last centuries. So I think we need to be very careful and very cautious about how we move this discussion forward, because knee-jerk reactions today will have a long-term impact for the future. As we look at climate change moving forward, so look, climate change for me is very, very real. We've had over 60 millimetres of rain at home in the last week. That has massive implications for the protein crops I will be producing, for the starch I will be producing on my farm. Now, it's very, very real. But the UK will be a great place to produce food when you look at all the climate change modelling. Because of our temperate climate, we will be very reliable. And yes, we'll have extremes of weather, nobody's going to doubt that. But I think at this moment in time, we turn our back on self-sufficiency and food production at our peril. Because you look at the political turmoil around the world, you look at the impact of climate change, and if we don't take responsibility for not just feeding our own population, but also looking to build those export markets where we genuinely are world leaders, then I think that's going to be a day that we look back on with massive regret. When we look at the lab-grown proteins and protein production in the future, our poultry industry converts feed into poultry meat at about 1.3 kilograms to 1. Our fish industry can produce 1.1 kilograms of input to 1 kilogram of output. So we really need to make sure that what we're moving to is genuinely more sustainable than what we've come from. Because it still requires an input source. It's not that you get something from nothing. And I do think that governments around the world at some point will recognise that feeding the population will have an environmental impact. You can't feed 70 million people on this island or 7 billion people globally without having an environmental impact. And that's why we have to be absolutely best in class, absolutely world leading. And then I can sell that story to anybody about why we should continue to produce in the way that we are, making sure that we are the most efficient that we possibly can be. The regulatory framework has a huge role to play. And we need an enabling regulatory framework that enables competitive, commercial, profitable farming businesses. Because actually that's what will drive investment, that's what will drive excitement in the industry, in the sector, and lead to the solutions about the challenges that we're looking to, the reducing of emissions. If you look at that as the big challenge, if we have that enabling framework, then that will help deliver the solutions to how we reduce emissions. And then finally, I think we really do need to think about sustainable intensification again. There seems to be a lot of thinking about extensification, But I think we really need to be thinking about sustainable intensification, producing more from less, and actually recognizing that truly sustainable food production will work in symbiosis with environmental delivery.
Thank you, Tom. I think I agree with you. We really shouldn't turn our back on food production. I think it makes good points there. But I think, as Russ will probably go on to discuss, but I suppose it's not all just about the production. That in some of the research that Ivy Farm have talked before, the lab-grown beef can cut emissions by up to 92%. So there's the sort of the climate angle against the production angle. So I'll be interested to get Russ's thoughts later on. But first, yes, Anthony Brown.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Onward, for putting on this fascinating event. So in my constituency, I've got lots of farms, they're great. I've also got lots of life science companies, and some of them are doing a lot of research on what we call cellular technology. And one of them was, one of my constituents was a co-founder of a company called Meatable, which is actually based in the Netherlands, but it produces lab-grown meat. And this set me on a journey of speaking to all the different companies and people involved with this. And over the last 6 months, and I've spoken since to the various regulators and so on. And we are, I'm convinced, on the brink of a massive revolution, and I think it's better that the UK is prepared for it. There are all sorts of alternative proteins which Victoria mentioned, many of which already exist and are on sale. There are some that aren't yet allowed to be on sale in the UK, such as Apostle Burger, that's got a GM thing in it. But I think cultured meat is the one probably longer term where there'll be the biggest change. So cultured meat is, we have the technology to grow cells in fact in my constituency there's a lot of human cells for the clinical trials, it's not for therapeutic purposes, but actually you can grow animal cells in bioreactors and grow it and start growing it at scale. And there are now about 100 companies around the world that are doing this work. It's primarily in the United States and Israel. We've got 3 in the UK, I think. So Ivy Farms is one. There's Higher Stake. So Ivy Farms is Oxford, Higher Stake is in Cambridge, and we've got the Clean Food Group. And in December last year was the first time that cultured meat had been approved for sale anywhere in the world by the regulatory authorities in Singapore. It was put on sale. It was cultured chicken nuggets in the 1812 restaurant. Quite expensive chicken nuggets, £12 a portion. The food program, the BBC food program, sent out a correspondent to try what they were like, so test what it tastes like, and the correspondent there said it was indistinguishable from real chicken meat. Really quite remarkable. So the key test here is how will the industry develop. So that there are many hundreds of millions of dollars of investment going in it around the world. And the biggest companies in Australia, such as Memphis Foods, which I just learned has changed its name to Upside, and Just Eat, which is the company that, Eat Just rather, which is the company that produces the chicken nuggets. They've both raised close to $200 million. Bill Gates has been investing in it, Richard Branson has been investing in it. I just learned that Leonardo DiCaprio has been investing in it as well. And the biggest food companies in America, like Tyson and Cargill, are all investing in these companies now because they see there's a huge opportunity there. And the two tests for cultured meat, well, there's 3 tests. The key two sort of market ones are what does it taste like? Will it be acceptable to consumers? Do people like the idea of eating hamburgers or fake meat or whatever else? And the other test is price. If it's more expensive, it's clearly going to be far more limited. Now, on the taste side, and that's up to consumers to decide. Some people will like it, some people may not. It depends, and I'm sure if there's lots of investment going in it, people will work out how to make it taste really close down. And on the price side, and the prices have come down really dramatically already. They're sort of halving every 6 months or so, and or every year or so. It seems pretty clear on the trajectory. It will become quite competitive quite soon. The arguments for cultured meat, why would anyone want it? There is an environmental argument, which is that it reduces greenhouse gas emissions, and there's some estimates in the US that it reduces for beef by about 70% or so, although there are other estimates, and I'm sure people, livestock farmers may contest that, but growing body of research about that. The other argument is just the animal welfare argument. There are lots of people, I love meat, I should say, I'm a massive meat eater, I love steaks, I love roast chicken, I love bacon and everything else. I also like animals, and I think a lot of people, if they could eat meat without it involving killing an animal, I think probably, particularly in Britain, there's quite a lot of people who choose to do that. and cultured meat potentially gives you the opportunity for doing that. The third key test is the health and safety one. This has to be safe to eat, clearly. Clearly, if it's bad for human health, then you shouldn't be doing it. And that's where the regulation comes in, and the Food Standards Agency in the UK. So my broad position on this is I've become pretty convinced that this revolution is happening, and it probably will be quite a big scale. It may not work out. We might come back in a year's time or 5 years' time and go, what was that all about? But actually, I'm pretty sure this is going to happen. And I think it's given that it's happening, and given that there are leading companies elsewhere in America, Israel, Singapore, Japan, doing it, but I think we in the UK ought to be open to it. And I think the regulatory regime here, the Food Standards Agency does have this novel foods regulatory approval process, but they haven't thought much about cultured meat at the moment. I've had various meetings with them, and they haven't really had any discussions about it. So lots of other countries around the world have set up a little task force to look at all the regulatory issues around cultured meat, and there are lots of them, and just to work out how what the approval process should be, what you need to go through, and so on. I'm sure Russ will talk about that a bit more. So I just think we need to be open to it. But ultimately, this is about consumer choice, and let the consumers decide what they want to eat or not eat. And I think that Britain should be, the UK government should be open to facilitating this rather than inadvertently blocking it. And I just add in one little anecdote, which is that Eat Just, that made the chicken nuggets in Singapore, they offered to do a tasting in the UK Parliament, and I was very happy to host that. There's a few MPs who are interested in this issue. Be the first tasting in Parliament of cultured meat. And but the chief executive of the Food Standards Agency sent me a letter saying it would be illegal under their interpretation of imported EU law. Now I'll contest that interpretation actually, because it's not about marketing. But anyway, that's the hurdle we have. In Singapore, it's commercially sold, approved and commercially sold by a very highly respected Food Standards Agency. In Britain, we can't even do a tasting in Parliament because it's banned by the Food Standards Agency. So I think we need to be open to the future.
Thank you, Anthony. Yeah, I think you made a good point there, that it should just be a part of the plethora of options we have going forward in both land farming, culture meat, all these sort of innovative farming practices need to be facilitated. And Russell, let's leave it up to you.
Thanks, Ted. Thanks, Anthony. So by 2050, there'll be 10 billion people on the planet, and that's an increase in 25% versus today. But actually, the demand for meat is going to go up by 70%. Because people love meat, that's the reality. And at Ivy Farm, we think that we have a way to create a sustainable meat and provide part of that solution. So what we do is we take a small sample of meat from a living animal, such as a pig or a cow, a biopsy about the size of a plain dice. And we extract the cells from that piece of tissue and put them in a large tank that we call a bioreactor. In that tank, we fill it with water, with all of the nutrients that the cells need to grow, to proliferate. And after about 2 to 3 weeks, we can bring muscle and fat together to make mincemeat products. And that's what we're focused on at Ivy Farm, just on creating better quality mincemeat. We found that, or we intend to be making 12,000 tonnes of meat by 2025. And if we can achieve that, it would save 170,000 pigs from slaughter. So right now we're a team of 40 people. We spun out from the University of Oxford in 2019, moving into multi-million-pound R&D facilities in November. And by 2023, we want to create an urban farm where consumers can come and visit us and taste our product. Now, if you've ever been to a craft brewery and you've seen the tanks with the beer being made, and then you can have a pint and understand the process, we're envisaging exactly that. So consumers can come to us, understand the process, see how it's made, have transparency around that, and try our product, tuck into a delicious sausage or burger. A recent report from Oxford Economics, commissioned by us, showed that by 2030, cultivated meat could add £2.1 billion to the UK economy. That's 13% of the agriculture sector. It could add over 16,000 jobs, more than 8,000 of those being highly skilled jobs. And it could contribute more than £500 million to the UK tax revenue. But for us to do that, we need to start moving. We need to make sure that process does not get in the way of progress. What we would like to do is allow consumers the opportunity to vote with their wallets. So get these products on the shelves, work with the regulators to ensure that they are safe and demonstrate that, not cut any corners, that once they're on the shelf, let consumers buy it and have that choice, empower them. As Anthony was saying, we've seen very recently that in Singapore, the product is available for sale. And now that we're outside of the EU, we can do things slightly differently. There's an opportunity to flex our regulatory muscle, think about agility and speed. And what we are encouraging the FSA to do is to work closely with us on an iterative process to get this product ready for approval. Because if we don't have an iterative way, it basically can cause quite a large delay of getting this product to the market, and the UK will be left behind versus other countries. The other advantage of cultivated meat is that at Ivy Farm in particular, we're committed to using renewable energy to make our meat in the future, to make it as sustainable as possible. So we believe it's in line with the government's flagship green agenda, and also it's a way of helping securing a protein source into the future that is high quality for consumers to enjoy. We're not looking for any shortcuts. We're not looking to kind of rush this through. We want to work really closely and make sure we tick all of the necessary standards. But we've seen in Israel and Singapore in particular that the regulatory environment has been created there where the companies can work very iteratively, and there has been robust support and investment from government into the industry. So in Britain, if we don't start acting now, we're at risk of really falling behind in this rapidly growing industry.
Fantastic, thank you, Russ. Some really great comments by everyone. I just think before we open to the floor to discuss, I'd be keen to first just pose my own question. Particularly I'm interested in sort of how we, a key part of innovation is trying to catalyse private investment into these sort of innovative farming practices like cultivated meat, for instance, vertical farming and gene editing. Firstly, just I'd be keen to ask Russ, what do you think could be done by the government to help mobilise private capital to come into a business like yours? And then I'd be keen to go to Victoria afterwards.
Well, to Anthony's point, there's quite a lot of companies around the world trying to create cultivated meat. And when I talk to investors, and there's investors in Britain, but they're looking globally, and I talk to global investors as well that are looking at us, they're deciding, well, why Ivy Farm? Why invest in British technology that's been spun out of Oxford University? Why not go to America, go to Israel, go to Netherlands, or Singapore, where the regulation is there? And that's where we really need government support for this industry to demonstrate that actually, invest in Ivy Farm, and there is a route to get this to market in the country where the technology has been invested, technology has been created. So really, it's about creating a favourable environment where an investor can see that the technology can be developed in the country and can be taken further in the country too. And it's not going to kind of hit barriers. The big challenge for us is the time it takes for us to build a facility to produce this product is a couple of years. A large bioreactor takes about 12 months from the moment you order it to actually get it and put it in the facility. And we're looking to cut that down. But right now, with the regulatory approval process, we submit a dossier for a completely new process that we haven't really had the full discussions with the FSA on yet on what they need to see. And then it goes into kind of a black box for 18 months, and we wait to find out what other information they might ask for. Now ideally, during that process, we would have a conversation so that then we can start to invest. We can start to build the facilities, build the plants, buy the reactors, get them in place, so that when regulatory approval comes through, we can start selling. Otherwise, regulatory approval will come through, and then we can start to invest. And then it's another 2 to 3 years until we can get this product to consumers.
Okay, just before you go to Victoria, can I add something? Because I think she might want to comment on this as well. But I mean, the SFA clearly there is proving a little bit of a blocker at the moment. And I think our experience at the moment of the SFA is that it's also not reacting quickly enough, particularly when I look at registering GM imports, which we've been reliant on for years and years. Some 3, 4, 5, 6 million tonnes a year coming into the UK, and at the moment they're not getting through the FSA approval process. And this is going to start to create really big delays and some serious problems. And these are products, not new products. We need new products registered, but these are products we've already been importing. So I think the FSA is actually, potentially is quite a blocker at the moment.
And Victoria, would you want to come in just on how we can help to propel private investment?
Well, I'm not wishing to duck any of this at all, but the FSA it comes under the aegis of the Department of Health, and I do work very, very closely with them. In fact, over the last turbulent 18 months in food supply, and because of the stresses and strains caused by the pandemic, I have worked increasingly closely with the FSA, and we have a great relationship. I think, I think probably we need them to be part of this discussion. It is important that we do have an independent regulatory body to check that our food is safe. And one of the times over the last 18 months when regulation has in fact been a hot topic has been when we talk about trade deals, for example, and we talk about hormone-treated beef or chlorine-washed chicken, and suddenly the FSA and their rules and regulations are at the top of every farmer and consumer agenda. However, we do work with them, but we don't control them, and I think that probably is the right way to have a regulatory body. I can't talk for them, if you see what I mean. I can, however, say that the government is looking at the 4 different types of alternative protein that I listed earlier. This is an area that people are interested in, consumers are interested in, and it's right that we should look at that. It's hard to know exactly what Russ is asking for. I think if he's asking for government to have an open mind, absolutely, I think that's right. I think if he's asking for government to be genuinely evidence-based and interested in science, again, I think actually this government has demonstrated that quite a lot over the last 18 months, and that's a good thing. One area that we find it hard to talk about is the 60 or so GM products that that are already approved for use in this country that we don't discuss very often, do we, Tom? And the soy in feed, animal feed, for example, that does come in large quantities and is a GM product. We've started, I think, quite bravely to have a conversation about gene editing or plant breeding, as I usually refer to it. This year, and we've had a sensible and evidence-based, if that's any consolation to us, consultation about gene editing. The government is genuinely interested in how to take forward the regulatory framework in that area, and that ought to give, I think, some, I don't know if comfort's the word, but some proof that the government is genuinely going to look at this in a scientific way. We do, I think it's right that government deals with regulation and consumers deal with their own demands and what they want from their food. And I think it's right that we will look at all 4 different types of alternative proteins that I listed earlier. This isn't going to happen tomorrow, though.
Yeah.
So my various discussions with the FSA about cultural meats, and they clearly haven't really thought about it in terms of, certainly haven't had meetings with the industry, and I'm now trying to facilitate meetings between the high-level people in the FSA and industry can be invited. They haven't even thought about the process of regulation of it, and this is a very, very new technology. So there's all sorts of issues about like traceability of the cell line. How do you define that? You've got traceability of farm animals, but this is traceability of the cell line, which you then need to regulate in an bioreactor, the agents and the bioreactor and the chemicals in there. What regulation do they need for that? And they basically said, well, when somebody applies, for a licence, we'll work out how to regulate it, but we don't know the regulatory regime at the moment, or how it would operate. And that, as I said, in many other countries, I certainly know Japan, Netherlands, Singapore, United States, the government set up working groups with the industry, with the regulators, to actually work out how do you actually regulate something like this, which is so completely new. And I think it would be worthwhile for the UK to set up such a working group just to tease through the issues, you know, and work it out. We're actually at a position where, as I said earlier, the FSA won't even allow tastings because it's got a highly defensive, restrictive interpretation of EU law, where if they do tastings, actually even in other EU countries they do tastings, and even under the same EU law. So we've more gold-plated that. I just think the FSA needs to be slightly more facilitative, as it were, but without lower standards.
And Russ, do you want to come back? Well, I've got one more question there. Do you want to come back on any of that?
Yeah, please. So I think what I would like to see from the FSA is speed and the resources and expertise to be able to work with us. We've been talking to other food standards agencies around the world, and to give an example, we dialed into a call with the US. They had 12 people on the call to join the discussion because it was so new and they wanted to understand and absorb as much as they can as they think about the regulatory process. We have no way near the same response from the FSA. It's actually very difficult to get engagement. So I would like to see the right resources and expertise to be able to have those conversations. And I think, Minister, I would call on DEFRA to create a food technology champion by the end of Q1 next year. We've seen so much innovation come through in the UK in food technology that someone similar to the Net Zero champion really driving this agenda forward I think would be a win-win for Britain.
Great, thank you, Russ. And then I've just got one question I'd like to go on to. Actually, to Tom, you spoke about this, and obviously the need to really use the land we've got and make the most of the land in the UK for food production. And then I sort of was thinking about what Russ was saying about population growth in 30 years. I'd be interested to get this sort of your take and the NFU's take on how actually, you know, with the increased demand for food that will come, whether, I know you obviously don't want to rewild our country, but whether actually think, you know, things like cultured meats and vertical farming do fit into that equation alongside the traditional farming you talk about.
I mean, I guess I always look at who are the customers of UK agriculture, and you know, if you take the debate into the dairy field, you know, there's been a lot of debate about Oatly, and Oatly will still be a customer of UK agriculture. Okay, so it's very difficult because it's detrimental to one sector, but it's a customer for another sector. And I look at what we...
Same culture.
Exactly, that's what I'm about to say.
All the inputs of growing food.
And that's exactly what I was about to come on to. Yeah. So I look at what we're hearing here, and we're sort of saying, well, actually, for one sector, and look, I don't ever see it replacing your juicy steak that you have out in a restaurant, or that you on a Friday night you get home and you think, I really fancy a nice piece of fillet tonight. I don't think it's going to replace that. But is it a case of either or? I don't believe it is. You know, I think it's actually, it might be that Monday to Wednesday you're eating one thing, and that other days, you know, your luxury might be, if it's affordable, and clearly these are the barriers we need to get to. You know, actually, if you're going to eat something which is called a chicken nugget, which isn't a chicken nugget, which is 5 times the cost of a chicken nugget, why are you going to eat it? And so it's got to be more sustainable. It's got to be cheaper, and it's got to reduce the environmental.
It's got to taste good.
But if it ticks those boxes, I'm not going to turn around and say, hang on, we're going to shut the market to another output for UK agriculture. So, you know, we've got to be very open-minded about where the future is. But also, what we cannot do, and what I see more and more of, is that I think we're very, very close to exporting our industry overseas. And if we export our industry overseas, we don't just export the primary production, we export the manufacturing industry. And we export all the jobs that go with it. The £120 billion food and drink industry will go. And the inflationary pressures we are seeing in primary production at the moment are, we have not seen this pressure in decades that we are under at the moment. You couple that with labour availability, and these rising costs will mean that if we're not very careful, we will export our conscience and our environmental footprint. We will still be reliant on those same workers producing that food overseas, and think that's okay because we've washed our hands of it. Now look, this is just complete hypocrisy. And so there is definitely a balance here about how we produce the food of the future, and we will never want to shut an output for UK agriculture.
Your concern about exports is true also in cultured meat. And so
Yes.
there are companies doing this, and they are developing massive investment going in. And what I think will be sad for the UK is if we end up,
If we're not in the
industry,
game.
we're not in the game, we
Yeah.
end up importing it all from America or whatever. It's far better that we actually produce it here and use the input from British farms, which needs to go.
So
into.
we need
We need to be in the game.
We need
rather
to
than-
capitalise on the good things from the pandemic, which includes a much greater interest from the consumer in where their meat comes from and where their food comes from generally. We know now that people are more interested than they have been in the past, and we need to have a fairly grown-up discussion about transparency and what people really want from their food.
And Victoria, labelling is critical. You know,
Oh, I agree.
what really has got our members' backs up this last 18 months of our Oatly is the way they have attacked the dairy industry. Now, that is not acceptable, actually. The false truths or the lies that have been told is not acceptable. We need to have grown-up, open, transparent conversations, and that's why the carbon footprints, we need to see what is the carbon
Yes.
footprint of your product,
Absolutely.
what's the carbon footprint of a grass-fed beef animal, and let's have that conversation. Let's have a grown-up science
And
space.
one of the other issues about Oatly, it absolutely has its place, I agree with you, but the protein content, just going back to the health argument of Oatly, is nothing like that of dairy milk. And we have to be very careful what the consumer is really aware of when they're making those buying decisions, because in health terms and in dietary terms, we need to make sure that the diet is balanced.
So there's a key issue here when it comes to the labelling question as well. So Oatly is not dairy milk, clearly. It's completely
No,
different.
it's
All
a
these-
different
all these
product.
different alternative milks like almond milk. I mean, I just drink dairy milk.
They're water, actually, they're not.
Yeah, I mean, they are different products. They
Yes.
might also make tea or coffee black, but they're not dairy milk. The thing about cultured meat is that it is actually the same. The end product is basically the same. Well, certainly that's the journey that the industry is trying to get to. So if you have beef cells or whatever, it is identical to cow cells, but it just didn't grow as part of an animal. They grew in a lab thing. So the actual product is exactly the same. And so the labelling points is an interesting thing about meat, about what is definition of meat. So I think there's been quite a lobby in Washington by the livestock industry, not the food companies like Tyson and Cargill, but the livestock producers, to strictly use the word meat only to that stuff that comes from an animal. And actually, so far they've been resisted because the meat should describe what the actual product is, and it doesn't matter the method of production. And I suspect that's a debate will end up in the UK.
We've got a labelling consultation going on at the moment, and in fact I've seen several people in this room and have been in previous events where we've talked about religious slaughter, for example. So we've started the beginnings of the conversation about labelling. I mean the ag transition is challenging, I talk about it a lot, but the labelling transition or where we're going on labelling is also going to be a real challenge for us over the next few years. And we need to be open-minded but have a great deal of consumer engagement in this conversation.
Can I just I've realised, conscious of time, should probably open the floor to some questions. It's been a great discussion. But, a few questions here, so we might just do it in pairs if that's all right. So the lady down here.
Abby Kay from Saudi magazine. It's a two-part question really. Anthony, the image that you're painting of an industry that's been invested in by Bill Gates and Leonardo DiCaprio, that's going to strike fear into the hearts of a lot of ordinary people. Most people don't want to have a food industry that is controlled by a couple of multi-billionaires, So my question is, how do you ensure that the regulatory framework prevents that takeover from happening and ensures that small businesses can still thrive? And the second part of my question is, do you envisage that this transition will mean that livestock farmers will be put out of business? I mean, I'll take the point that you make, Tom, about a stake coming from traditional farming, but what happens to the rest of the carcass in that scenario?
And just one more question here, and then we'll get started.
My point is two things. If UK agriculture is producing 40% of our food, probably 55% of our calories, why aren't we at the top of the tree for reducing impact rather than one of the low-hanging fruits? The constant knocking of it, as Tom said, will chase the industry abroad. There was a Redcar blast furnace produced 10% of the EU steel and yet people kept knocking it in this country, and so our steel industry's gone. The second point is, I read that advert there, cultivated meat is real meat with 90% less carbon footprint. The work you're doing is marvellous. It's not as marvellous as getting a nitrogen fixing wheat would be, but it's marvellous. But is that taking into account the grass that would grow and rot back and give carbon off anyway, the energy it would need to control fire breaks and things we've seen other countries abroad where they're too idle to control the fire breaks. On the North Yorkshire moors, there was still barley to cut last week. That grass fields next to it that couldn't be ploughed have got to produce something. They can't go in to grow in cereals because there just isn't the weather after one. The driest September there's been, they're still can't they cut there, they're just growing it for the straw. So you think of controlling the growth on the mowers. I think that the cattle and the sheep are doing a lot of good controlling that carbon anyway. Is that taken into account? When you think of what farming does, when I left school, 2,600 weight an acre was the yield of wheat. A couple of years ago, our average was 5 tonne an acre. And that was with incorporating the straw, as you say, probably locking up as much carbon as planting a few sticks on it.
Thank you. So just initially, just the question here about regulation and then about a farmer's livelihood. I'd like to ask you first.
Yeah, so I think you asked a really, really important question. It's actually what concerns me most about the development country meat. I mean, one is it should absolutely have no detrimental impact on human health, but we assume the regulators will do its job. The other one is actually that it doesn't end up with big meat, that you end up with a few like corporations that control all meat production in the world. I think that would be absolutely terrible. And the thing about livestock farming, obviously, there's relatively low barriers to entry. You know, there's lots of different livestock farmers. Here, there's quite big barriers to entry because you've got to have this really quite sophisticated technology, you've got to have these big investments and so on. And so that is a real concern. I mean, and again, I think that's one of the things the government should think about going forward.
I can talk about that till the cows come home.
Yeah. But yeah, no, so I mean, I think that's a real thing to watch out for and be concerned about going forward with culture meat. It doesn't end up dominated by a few big companies.
So food supply chains are absolutely critically important at the moment. We're seeing with this problem in the pig industry and what happens when some very large processors take over a large part of the industry. Though there are many pressures in the pig industry, I should say, that's not the only reason we've got difficulty. The Chinese market is and various other issues are it's all quite complex, that problem at the moment, and really difficult for those involved. But I would, in regulatory terms, I would go back to the Ag Act, where we have now given ourselves the powers to look at the food supply chain. One of the very first things that I did when I became farming minister was ask for an investigation, and we did a consultation about the dairy supply chain, and that has been very interesting and very useful. There is still more work to do, but I was very keen to move on to the pig industry next. Unfortunately, the pandemic intervened, and we're just starting that work now, but the events of the last few months in the pig industry have shown us why food supply chains really matter and why it is important that government does have the powers that we now have under the Ag Act to look at the way that those supply chains work. And farmers get about 9% of the value in some of those food supply chains of the food that we all enjoy consuming, and we need to look at whether that's fair or not. In food security terms, absolutely, we do need to be very careful with environmental claims. It's very difficult to find safe and easy measures of carbon capture, for example. And another priority for government, and one that I'll be talking to the Secretary of State about later, I think, on the main stage, is the importance of biodiversity. And of course, I think so you come from the North Yorkshire moors, and you will know that some of those wading species, for example, becoming worryingly rare in other parts of our country, need the landscape and the setup with very light sheep grazing, possibly a bit of cattle grazing, in order to thrive. And it is really important and a real goal of government that we look at these nature goals at the same time as looking at net zero and maintaining food security about where we are at the moment, about 60%. So the three challenges, the three pillars, have to be looked at together.
Thank you.
I'm just south of the North Yorkshire moors, in the Vale of Pickering. We had 70 lapwings rose up in a flock from a field of oilseed rape this time. So you can get good results on arable land as well as by just letting it go to rubbish.
Brilliant. And Russ, I just wondered if you wanted to come back. I'm interested in actually the carbon footprint aspect of this as well. A bit of detail on that would be really interesting.
Yeah, sure. I think we want to work alongside the best of British farming. To Tom's point earlier, we're not looking to try and make the juicy steak and the delicious joint that you have on a Sunday. We want to be alongside those farmers, British farmers, that are making the great products to fill that part of the market. Instead, we're producing the processed mincemeat type products. With regards to the kind of environmental impact, I think this is back to the labelling point. This is what's really important, is that we have a standardised way of demonstrating what is the sustainability of that product, so consumers can make an informed choice. That is versus the number we quote there is versus kind of the average global cost of producing a kilo of beef. It's not necessarily the best of British farming. So I think cultivated meat is part of the solution, and we can offer a sustainable alternative alongside other sustainable offerings as well.
Russ, if you want to work with UK agriculture, I would suggest that figure is never used again. Because we know our beef production here is on average half of the global average. And if we genuinely want to work together, then that immediately will have farmers thinking, we can't trust this company. And that is, so I hadn't realised I sat in front of that 90%. But actually, it's that sort of thing. Yeah. It's that misinformation. Look, and you're doing it with the best endeavour, but I think we do need to compare it to the UK average, and potentially where the UK industry is moving in the future. But I just think that creates division, rather than the sense of actually we can coexist. And I think that if we're going to coexist, I think we need to moving forwards. And then we do need to work on that sort of thing.
I could say that he's doing it to his commercial advantage and my commercial disadvantage.
No, but to be fair to Russ, it's not just British meat that we eat in our supermarkets. So I think I understand why that figure would also make sense. But we've just got a few more questions as well, so I just want to get to as many as possible. The gentleman at the front here, and then the gentleman at the back over there.
Good morning, and firstly, thank you to the panel for a mind-stretching introduction to this subject this morning. My feeling is that perhaps if my ambition were to mine rare earth metals on Mars, I may be interested in the proposition presented by the left-hand side of the panel this morning. But it seems to me that there is very much a romantic vision of what rewilding actually means, which is completely divorced from reality. If you abandon farmland, what you are faced with is 20 years of dense, impenetrable bramble before you get anything else. You don't get wonderful butterflies and species. You get rabbits, foxes, and squirrels. I mean, basically, animals which are not threatened in terms of their survival. So, what will we be doing? Actually, abandoning our farmland and our ability to feed ourselves naturally, when even if we reforested the whole of the United Kingdom, we wouldn't replace the tropical rainforest that was felled around the world in 2020. So, our response needs to be proportionate to what we can actually achieve in this country, and it needs to be less romantic. The other point is, why would we then also abandon the stewards of the countryside, our farmers, who have maintained a beautiful landscape for centuries and will continue to do so? And may I suggest that rather than saving the slaughter of 170,000 pigs, you're actually denying a number of farm animals the opportunity to enjoy a life. And when it comes to gambling lambs in the spring, I think we would all agree that that would be a tragedy.
Thank you, sir. And yes,
legally, how would you label cultivated meat? I mean, would a cultivated chicken nugget be labelled as chicken, or would it be labelled as something completely different?
Interesting point. Yeah, I think on the first one, I think there's a consensus on the panel that actually, Russ, I'm sorry, I will go to it in a minute, but I think he's saying that he wants to work with British farming. He's not trying to replace it. So yeah, just one. I mean, on sort of rewilding and the need to secure British farming. I think Victoria probably tackled that, and then we'll get to judgment of that.
Okay, so we, as you know, sir, have set out from DEFRA our new future farming strategy. So we're moving away from area-based payments for farmers. I think the industry has been brilliant about coming on board with that and understand the reasons why we're doing that. And we're going to pay farmers in the future for producing, as well as the delicious food as part of their farming businesses, which we definitely want farmers to continue doing, we're going to pay them for producing public goods. It's complicated. Farming is complicated, and the way in which we coexist with our landscape is delicate and has built up over many, many centuries. When I think of the area that the gentleman next to you comes from, it is one that has been developed over thousands of years, and the delicate biodiversity has grown up over that time. And I think it's really, really important that we respect and nurture that balance. I did say that I was a farmer, and I think it's right that we also fess up that our care of nature has not always been what it should have been, and the way that we've been rewarded over the last 40 or 50 years has not necessarily encouraged care for biodiversity that we now know is important and we want to put some welly into, frankly. So farmland birds, for example, is one example that I often use, have really decreased over my lifetime. That is not acceptable. We want to do what we can now that we know that's the case, to reward farmers for putting that right. So the three pillars will remain. Food security, so farmers need to produce food. Carbon capture, yes, the government has ambitious targets and those are important. For goodness sake, we saw dreadful rain in London overnight. We know that the farmers know better than anybody that the weather is changing, and it's important that we help to play our part in dealing with that. But nature, biodiversity, is really critical too. Rewilding is not a term I find particularly helpful, but it is, I think land use change is how I tend to talk about it. Yes, that has a place in some parts of our nation, but we also need to do the other bits of those three pillars that I was talking about. So we will be encouraging some areas which are not particularly productive, probably, or where peat is particularly strong, to go in for land use change. We'll also be encouraging much more environmental management of normal farmland that continues to produce the food that we like to eat. So we'll be talking about agroforestry, we'll be talking about wilding, if you like, or I prefer to call it regenerative agriculture, going on along the sides of watercourses, which increases biodiversity. We'll be talking about herbal lays within fields. We'll be talking about hedgerows. I did a session on it yesterday. So there is a place for being more environmental within normal farming, and that is very much where our entry-level future farming, our future subsidy is aimed.
Fantastic, thank you, Victoria. And then just on the carbon labelling point, Russ, I'd be interested to get your take on how it would sort of fit into it, and actually what you'd like to see from the consultation on labelling.
Yes, I mean, we very much view this as real meat, just made in a different way. So we would like it to be labelled as meat. We are ultimately growing more muscle from muscle, more fat from fat. But it's about making it clear to consumers the process that we've gone through to do that. So we want that transparency on any sort of packaging so that people understand what they're buying. And then when it comes to sustainability, I think we need a really clear set of standards across all products, meat, cultivated meat, but also plant-based meats as well. We should be really clear about what are the sustainability credentials of those products so that consumers can make an informed decision.
But on that point, sorry, do you want to go?
No, you carry on. I just want to ask how it's labelled in Singapore in a minute.
On the point of labelling and footprints, if climate change is the challenge of our time, globally we have to come up with a way that everyone can unite behind as to how we look at carbon footprints. There is still too many conversations about which is the right way of calculating the carbon footprint. And while we're having the arguments about how we calculate it, we're not looking at the bigger challenge of how we stop the impact. And we've got to get behind that and sort that out, because I absolutely agree with you. We need to be able to say, this is how we're doing it, and this is what the footprint is. And then people can make choices. And there'll be some people who choose to buy something because of the animal health and welfare. There'll be other people who choose to buy something because of the carbon footprint. And actually those positions could be completely juxtaposed. Yeah, and that's the interesting thing as we look at this moving forward. You know, free-range chickens have a much higher carbon footprint than your intensively reared bird. But they're decisions people need to be able to make moving forward, and we've got to get to that point where it can be.
And I'm interested on the Singapore point about how we label it. Do you know any detail?
So at the moment it's sold through a restaurant and then through food delivery service. It's not on supermarket shelves yet. So the labelling is just through kind of the menu, telling people, you know, this is what you're buying.
And what do they say on the
I actually
menu?
answered that question.
Yeah.
The Economist this week, they've got a whole technology course on alternative proteins. In there they say that in Singapore the cultured meat must be labelled cultured.
Okay.
And instinctively I think that's the right thing, that it should be labelled meat, but it should be
Yeah.
clear that it's cultured and not from animal.
Okay, I'm afraid, sorry, I know we've got a few more questions, but I'm afraid we're out of time. And yeah, I'd just like to say a massive thank you to the panel. I thought it was a really fascinating discussion. I think it's overwhelmingly it came out of it is that actually, you know, cultured meat can be a part of the future of British food alongside British farming as well. And yeah, it'd be interesting to see how it progresses. But thank you all for coming, and we've got a few more events today if anyone's interested. Have a good come. Thanks.